Hi, love leaders. It's Dr. Shannon Roberts, your host for the Love Leading Podcast, where we discuss how to create connection in your most important relationship that God designed, bringing health and sometimes healing while deepening intimacy. Welcome to the show. Good morning, Love Leading community. Welcome to this episode of the Love Leading Podcast. And today we are continuing our series on Naked and Exposed, learning to love well using the Intimacy for Life method in your marriage. I'm walking you through my new book, which you can also find on Amazon. Not only in hardback publishing, but also Kindle. But today we are continuing in the conversation about neuroscience, how brain biology affects your relationship. And this is the part 2 of this neuroscience because it seems to be so thick and rich. And I just want to make sure that I can walk you through all of the information in somewhat understandable format. I hope I'm effectively communicating it in that kind of way. So where we've been, let's walk back first before we walk forward. We began just introducing what is this naked and exposed and this concept of vulnerability leading to intimacy on all levels of your relationship, your most important relationship that you are designed for. And then we've kind of walked through, well, if we're designed for this, if we are supposed to be connected in an intimate bond with one person, then what happens? Why is it so elusive? Why are we challenged to get there in our most important relationship? And then we've talked about how it didn't begin at that point. Most of the point in time when couples start out, they're very much in love. They're very much connected. And what happens over the course sometimes in a lot of relationships that shift in their attitudes. And so in order for us to completely understand what happens before we can talk about what to do about it, we had to go back to the neuroscience because I firmly believe that God reveals himself not only in his written word, but in our science, his spoken word. And we can find elements and attributes and truths to all about how we're made, why we're made in our science. And so last time in the part 1 of this series on neuroscience, we talked about just that natural instinctive autonomic nervous system response, that when we perceive danger, it activates that self-protective back brain that we don't even have to think about. We just kind of feel it in our bodies, that visceral response that energizes or moves us into self-protection mode. And either we take the response of fighting or flighting or fleeing. And in romantic relationships, especially, we are coming to realize that when we perceive a romantic partner to be emotionally unloving, unaccepting, unavailable, or unresponsive, we have the same kind of autonomic response mechanism to fight, flight, or freeze many times, because what we know to be true is that our bodies respond to emotional threats equally the same as what we perceive to be a physical threat of danger. And so continuing this conversation today, we need to go into the understanding of attachment science. And listen, what I love about the information era that we're in, that we can put our hands on so many different ways of attaining information, podcasts being one. Obviously, I'm a big podcaster myself. I love learning. I will always be a lifelong learner. But what I especially love about this is that attachment science, even though we've been studying it for decades, is really coming into that pulp culture of understanding. People are trying to understand attachment because one statistic I heard this morning is the number one problem in mental health right now. It's not a particular disorder like depression or anxiety. It is the culture of isolation. That isolation, whether chosen or whether self-imposed, is actually the biggest culprit to mental health challenges and disease. And so that makes sense with what I'm talking about today in attachment science, because we are neurobiologically pre-wired in the way that we are created to live in the context of close emotional connection. So we have to go back to that very first when you were born story so that you understand how that progresses to when you are in a partnership, marriage, intimate connection relationship. We are born with this need to regulate, to be in connection to, physically and emotionally, with primary caregivers. It's a survival mechanism so that when we feel as if our primary caregivers are not that safe haven of comfort or that secure base of provision, then there's a distress signal that goes off in babies. We all know they cry when they're scared or hungry or in need. They cry and they are informing that primary caregiver. It's an alert system to come near, because if they didn't, they wouldn't survive. And so what we find is this co-regulation system provides that care and comfort. And guess what? Primary caregivers are also pre-wired to move towards. It's not always fun to move towards a crying baby, but there is something distinctly in our nature to do that when that distress signal comes out, right? And as we know and as we see, what's our first response to those children? We reach for them. We draw them in. We emotionally provide whatever those needs are, and we emotionally provide care and comfort. And it is that interaction that allows the baby to feel safe and secure again, or to be calmed and comforted, or to have their needs met. And they are able to feel at their best when that co-regulation and those primary caregivers are present. And what we are understanding about that attachment base, attachment science, that attachment bond, is that when there is this safe haven element, that you are my soft place to fall, I can count on you to be there when I call with my needs, whether those be physical or emotional, or when I absolutely know of your presence and I am sure of that secure base. It allows me to go out in my best version of myself with utmost confidence to be able to go explore my world, right? So the two elements, safe haven, secure base, are pretty much in the definition of attachment-based relationships. And the distress signal that goes off when we fear the possible loss of those, or the distancing of those, or the rejection of those. But what we understand, though, that as we develop, I mean, this is all the way from birth to sometimes upwards 26 years of age, right? When our brain fully, that prefrontal cortex that I talked about last week, is fully developed. That in order for our emotional brain, our limbic brain, to get its most highly developed place through the age of possibly 26, it has to have that safe and secure co-emotional and physical provision regulation with primary caregivers. For it to pass through all of our developmental stages that are necessary for us to cook to well done emotionally. It allows us to have emotional regulation of our systems. We get on regular rhythms and cycles with sleeping, eating. As you know, babies nearing the bewitching hour of 5 to 7, their little nervous system, is at maxed out quality. They're ready to be comforted and be able to put to bed, right? So their little emotional development really requires those primary caregivers' intervention of provision and emotional comfort for it to fully develop through regulation, through trust building, which is a part of that separation anxiety that they are proven over and over again, that as they reach for their primary caregivers come towards or return to them. And so they're able to establish trust. They are able to move from dependence to independence as they continue to explore greater and greater portions of their world, knowing, like, for instance, the thought of their parent is right there on the playground behind them. And then they sometimes go in distances where even just the thought of their parents and when they return is enough for them to feel secure in their world without them. And then just passing through all of those developmental stages so that in that safe and secure primary caregiving regulatory system, they get to the place where they get all of those higher, more emotionally intelligent skills like empathy, stress tolerance, and self-esteem. And that intimate, safe, and secure bond is the ingredients that really form the strength of that bond. Comes through loving interactions, acceptance, availability, and responsiveness in the stress signals, right? And so when those primary caregivers go towards lovingly and with acceptance and with availability and responsiveness, it grows that emotional capability in the developmental season of a child's life. But here's the news about what we understand about romantic attachment. And this is really exciting. And we're going to be talking more about how the same kind of system tends to operate in romantic partnerships too, because what we realize is this attachment, that this neuroscience, this pre-wiring to feel connected in this world, but especially to one person in an intimate kind of way that God designed for us, it doesn't just stop when our emotional development is fully developed. It doesn't just stop when we become independent adults. It doesn't just stop when we can sustain ourselves out of that relationship with our primary caregivers. In fact, that neuroscience, that wiring system is present with us all the way until we die. And what happens is that it transfers. It transfers from primary caregivers to romantic partnerships. That our need to have a soft place to fall and a secure base in which we're sure of in order to go out into our world to become our best version of ourselves, that same kind of definition presents itself in that romantic attachment partnership. And it is intimately built and grown and deepened by the same ingredients. We have to know in our romantic attachment partnership that we feel loved and accepted and that they are available and responsive to us for our physical and emotional needs. And when we sense that that's not there, there is a distress, and we call out to our partner in order for them to come near and provide us care and comfort. So it has all the kinds of aspects of a primary caregiver and child intimate connection as it does in romantic partnerships. There are subtle differences, and we'll talk about those later, but it has all the definitions that you can see in the way that we can co-regulate emotionally and physically while in a safe and secure, connected relationship. And the Bible talks about it. So it talks about that we are to leave our parents and cleave to our new spouse, that is God's design, that we transition. So this attachment science is that physical presence of that biblical principle that we desire to be in a closely committed, closely connected relationship where we leave one and we move towards another. And it's really kind of exciting to see how scripture and science really kind of come hand in hand and illustrate itself. It happens so often. It's really kind of my tendency to really want to highlight when they do, especially in the area of romantic love. So this attachment, how we learn to love well because we are loved well, and how we transfer our abilities to love well, receive love well, to call out in distress when we don't perceive that that's happening, and how we respond to partners when they do is exactly where we're going. As you can well see that sometimes in family of origin, listen, I understand completely as I work in this field, there are areas sometimes of vulnerabilities and sensitivities that we develop because we haven't been perfectly parented. And I don't know a perfect parent out there. So we all have them, that when we are in a certain chronological developmental task, when we're trying to master this emotional stage, and maybe we haven't felt the safety and security from our primary caregiving, and we have in our distress called out, and maybe there hasn't been a coming towards. Sometimes we have pockets of vulnerabilities and sensitivities emotionally that we then have heightened awareness of. And the memory of those periods of time, or those breaches or betrayals or pain points, are actually reserved and held in our memory center called the amygdala. And so what we become aware of and what we're going to be talking more about next week is when those memories get activated and when someone triggers some of those areas of vulnerabilities and sensitivities in those intimate relationships, because our romantic partner can unlock and trigger those deeper recesses of our emotional brains better and more effectively than anyone else, because it matters most to us what they think, how they act, and how they feel about us. We can be our most insecure as well as our most secure. We can be our most self-protected as we can be the most vulnerable. It just depends on this attachment security system. So next week, that's it, love leaders community. We are going to be talking about what is that distress system? How do we call out? What is that all about? When is it effective and healthy? And when can we have to know that there needs to be some kind of remediation because it might be broken? So tune in next time to proper protest systems, managing those conflict. We're going to tie in this neuroscience so you realize how it all operates. It actually is sometimes a release system to a lot of the people to realize, oh, that's why I act the way I do. My brain makes me do it. I'm designed for that. I'm wired for that. I'm not crazy, but we have to know and understand it in order to shift and make changes in it so that it performs the most effective function, which is the ability to reconnect. So that's it today. Again, thank you for tuning in to the Love Leading podcast. I, again, am Dr. Shannon Roberts, your host, and make sure that you continue to listen and subscribe, or maybe send to another person this information so that they too can learn how to love well in their most important relationship.